So what's gonna happen to that woman who killed your doorman?
I don't know, Mom. It's so sad. She's all alone. I just wish I'd gotten to know her better. We might have found we had something in common.
Maybe you'll write a poem about her.
Joy. I'm so sorry. But don't worry. I'm not laughing at you. I'm laughing with you.
But I'm not laughing.
Hello, this is Cinematic Psychology here for my fourth attempt at video analysis. I am especially excited to be doing the video that I'm doing today, which is going to be a philosophical analysis on the 1998 film Happiness, directed by, and I apologize if I mispronounce this person's name, Todd Solondz. I am so excited because this is honestly the film that inspired me to make this entire channel. When I saw this, I really wanted to get into video analysis in the first place, but I never actually got around to analyzing it because the film is, you just have to be in a specific headspace to dive deep into it. And I also personally have to be sort of hyper fixated on something in order to analyze it. But this is one of my favorite films of all time, and it is my all-time #1 comfort movie. Whenever I'm feeling upset or depressed or hopeless, I always turn to this movie, and without a doubt, it always brings me back into reality and makes me feel better. And so the purpose of this video, I'm going to be beginning by outlining my interpretation, my philosophical interpretation of what this movie is trying to say, going through some of the various characters and plot lines within the film to illustrate how they prove my philosophical theory correct, and then finally deciphering who I believe the hero of the movie to be, as well as the main message and whether or not I believe in this message. And to be honest, I'm still not sure. So first and foremost, if you have actually seen this movie and your takeaway is, I don't like it, it's scary, it's weird, it's depressing, it makes me feel uncomfortable. Well then, if you feel that way, and if you're advocating, for example, that this film should be banned, which a lot of people have, then you have no business on my channel. You have no business consuming media. You have no business talking. You have no business ever. You cannot be my friend. You need to get out. If you cannot watch this movie and appreciate its commentary on the human condition and existence, then you're just a waste of eyes and ears, and you have no business interpreting anything. That is how strongly I feel about this film. I think that this film does tackle uncomfortable situations and subject matter, but it does this for a specific purpose, to bring us into awareness of our own follies as humans and our own existence. This is awareness that we should constantly be striving for and questioning. Now, that being said, we don't have to take the thesis of the movie as absolute reality. I personally do not. I think that there's more to it than simply subscribing to a movie and saying that this is the answer to all that we are searching for. I think doing so is, in fact, living in bad faith. You need to constantly be looking for answers, but this movie has value to it. So I want to talk about what it's trying to say and why I believe that it's trying to say it. So my basic interpretation of this film is that it is a philosophical manifesto of the concept of absurdism. Absurdism. So the nihilistic assumption that both existentialism and absurdism embrace is that life is inherently meaningless. The way that these two philosophies differ is that existentialism basically says that it is our responsibility as humans to find meaning in the meaninglessness, to create meaning for ourselves. And absurdism rejects this responsibility and instead sort of says that finding meaning where meaning's not there actually creates more harm than good, suffering for ourselves, suffering for other people, and is disingenuous. The absurdist rather advocates for embracing the absurdity of life with full, authentic knowledge that absolutely nothing matters. And this in itself is an act of rebellion. Authenticity in the face of absurdity is an act of rebellion. And through this, we find liberation. And that is a very simplified analysis. If you want to learn more about absurdism, I recommend checking out Camus. He's a pretty interesting dude, can definitely tell you more about absurdism than I can. And to look to me for the absolute definition of absurdism is quite absurd. So anyways, moving on to how happiness relates to the concept of absurdism. The basic plot of happiness is centered around a group of people with a family at the core. And this group of people, they don't really have any true problems outside of the ones that they create for themselves, except for joy, and we'll talk about joy a little bit more. However, all of them are absolutely and irreparably miserable. And they are miserable despite the fact that they all tackle life and the question of finding meaning in it in vastly different ways. It all leads to the exact same end, and that end is never happiness. I'm going to be focusing my analysis on three sisters who are at the center of the movie. And these three sisters are Trish and Helen and Joy. And the sisters each represent a different path in life that society will tell you could potentially lead to happiness. These are conventionally acceptable and, according to our conventional knowledge, things that will in fact bring you joy, bring you happiness, bring you fulfillment. And this movie interrogates those three paths through each of the three sisters. The first sister is Trish. And the path towards happiness that she embraces is the path of family. She has on the surface the perfect family, and as soon as they say on the surface the perfect family, all the true crime fans know things are going to go wrong. And she has her son, she has her husband, who she sincerely adores, and she's very high and mighty, developing a very fragile, kind of petty identity around them, while constantly seeking validation from her husband. Now, as the people who have already seen this movie know, this does not work out for Trish's favor because her husband is, in fact, a child abuser. And by the end of the movie, the truth comes out. And the truth always will. It's inevitable. And all of a sudden, her entire life, everything that she built her identity around, her family around, her hopes, her happiness, it all completely shatters. And we're definitely going to be talking more about Bill, her husband, because he represents something more sinister, and we'll go into that a little bit later. But what's really fascinating is that to the viewer, this situation is extremely obvious. And that is the case with all of the sort of follies and delusions that the characters suffer. As the viewer, we're giving sort of like a godlike ability to peer into their lives and their weaknesses and see how obvious these things are. But the viewers are helpless to help the characters realize how oblivious they are. And that sort of creates a situation where it's reflective of our own experiences, which is why this movie is laughing at us and with us, and we're not laughing at all. But anyways, there is one scene in particular that I'd like to mention where she is talking to her husband in bed. And the viewer already knows that the husband is going to be arrested soon for the child abuse that he has been conducting. And as he's talking to Trish, he is asking her, "Do you love me unconditionally?" And Trish, completely oblivious to her husband's true nature, says, "Yes, of course I do." And as viewers, we know this isn't true. And it shouldn't be true. And the fact that people can sort of create this promise of loving somebody unconditionally and this ideal of loving somebody unconditionally is absurd. And basically, this movie comes to the conclusion that you cannot dedicate yourself to someone else in that same way, because human beings are not worthy of that kind of dedication. They will ultimately disappoint you. They will ultimately shatter any sort of delusions that you may have about them. She built her entire family around the patriarch of Bill, and Bill was unworthy of this, and this is proven to be inevitable by the film. So if you cannot dedicate yourself to your family, and you cannot dedicate yourself to a husband or a romantic figure, then the natural alternative, of course, would seem to be dedicating yourself to success. And this is represented by the sister of Helen. Helen is the most glamorous sister. She has written some sort of book or multiple books about dark, mysterious themes that people just love. And she has so many male admirers, and they're all so artistic and interesting, and she's so beautiful, and she's so quote unquote happy. And she's created this sort of persona. And she's sort of fallen in love with this persona in the same way of the Greek myth of Narcissus, who fell in love with his own reflection until he died. However, the true Helen, outside of the persona, in a private moment, was seen to be breaking down in self-hatred, feeling completely alienated from the own work that she created. She felt like she was a fraud because her work dealt with themes of, for example, child abuse that she had never even experienced. And then Alan, this creepy guy, this creepy neighbor who lives with her, and she doesn't know who he is, he calls her anonymously with all of these extremely lustful threats. And she feels intrigued by these threats because she develops the delusion that he could impose the abuse that she never actually experienced. And through this, she comes up with this sort of delusion that she can reconcile the disconnect she feels from herself and her artistic work. However, as you can see from this scene, when they actually meet each other,
This isn't working.
No.
You're not my type.
No.
that this reconciliation is completely impossible. And to think that it is possible is absurd. Because when somebody achieves any kind of success, whether it's artistic or from an invention or from any sort of career, it is always based on external factors. Success is not receiving, it's giving. And when you give, you cannot take it back. Whatever you give to the world, that belongs to them now. It does not belong to you. So your success itself is not yours, but rather a reflection of yours in a lake that the longer you stare at, the more alienated from you you will become. This is why it's such a common experience for example, musicians who create a song and the song becomes an overnight sensation and the musicians will resent it because it doesn't not belong to them anymore and it does not feel like it's a reflection of them. This reflection cannot be reconciled with, and success itself cannot give you happiness. So if success cannot give you happiness and family cannot give you happiness, surely there must be something that can give you joy, right? So what is more important than your own success or love or family? Of course, it must be altruism, right? Living your life for other people, for the greater good, for trying to make a positive difference in the world. Surely that kind of fulfillment will be stronger than any other, right? Well, this movie doesn't think so. So this movie questions altruism through the character of Joy. Now, Joy is in a lot of ways sort of the punching bag of the family. The other sisters talk down to her in an extremely abusive way, thinking that she's going to be this huge failure, despite the fact that she's the one with the purest intentions and purest heart of all, perhaps suggesting that, according to this movie, this is in fact a weakness and not a strength. Joy begins the film, the very first scene, breaking up with a terrible, disgusting, unappealing, abusive man. And despite the fact that she had every right to break up with this man, he ends up committing suicide, and she receives hostility from his family and all of this baggage, all of this guilt that she does not deserve. And her coworkers are completely indifferent because they can't even remember this person's name that killed himself. And to me, this suggests that the movie is saying these horrible traumas that we experience, the big world is really just apathetic to it. It does not do anything. It doesn't care. It can't really help you. And so Joy feels a bitterness towards her work because her coworkers don't seem to care about this tragedy, and she wants to make amends for the tragedy by doing good in the world. And her sister Helen says something quite interesting, which is, Joy doesn't need to do good because she is good. Oh, wait, what does that even mean? Like, I'm really kind of confused about how can you be a good person if you don't do good things? But that's like an entirely different philosophical conversation for another day. But anyways, so she decides to become a teacher for an adult refugee school. And the second she comes in, you know, she meets these people on strike who want their benefits, and she kind of scoffs at them, like, how could you only care about your own benefits? Can't you see that there are people in need? And, you know, they're like, you're a scab, we want our benefits. And she tries to just brush it off. But, you know, as soon as she comes in, you know, her students are cold and dismissive of her. They like a different instructor better than her, and she receives absolutely no gratitude. And as she's having the worst day and she's crying and she's regretting all of her choices, one of her students finds her on the street and offers her a ride home. And the entire encounter, he seems quite strange and, you know, not a particularly romantic figure. But despite that, she allows herself to become seduced by him with the greatest intentions. And then after that happens, he robs her. And his girlfriend beats her up, and then she comes to apologize to his girlfriend, and he hits her up for money again, which she gives away nonetheless. And once again, as she's being seduced by this student, the Russian taxi driver, the viewers can see how she's setting herself up for failure, but she can't. Because that's the absurdity of being in these sort of situations, is you cannot see from the outside the fantasies that we are falling into that are so separated from reality, and that will ultimately leave ourselves becoming fools. And that, my friends, is absurd. So now I want to return to Bill, Trish's husband, and the most controversial figure in the entire film, because of his child abuse that he enacts on his children. And the reason that he is such an important figure is because he shows how dangerous it can be to lose touch with reality so severely. He lives very deeply in this fantasy world focused on young boys, and he tries to reach that fantasy world, that escapism that he goes into, through causing harm to young children. This shows how a disconnection from reality doesn't just hurt yourself and make yourself foolish, but it can actually create real, tangible evil. Furthermore, one of the more uncomfortable elements of the film for a lot of people is watching him interact with his son. As his son is going through puberty, Bill discusses these sort of questions with his son in a way that crosses boundaries and makes people feel extremely uncomfortable. But this is actually really artfully done, because it questions the true dynamic of closeness between family members, which society likes to put on a pedestal as something beautiful, one of the greatest joys in life, but in reality is also one of the greatest evils. The greatest traumas come from these closeness, these crossings of boundaries, these violations. And when the son finds out the truth about his father, it is an absolutely heartbreaking scene. because the truth hurts and inevitably it will come out. So I'm not going to show that scene because I'm trying to keep the ratings of this video below 18. But now I'm going to be talking about who the hero of the story is. So the hero of this movie is actually the patriarch of the family, the father of the three sisters, Lenny. At the beginning of the film, Lenny tells his wife that he doesn't love her anymore. And despite that, he doesn't want to get a divorce. He doesn't particularly care or have any preference on what happens to their relationship. And he kind of accepts that she leaves. He doesn't try to get her to stay. He doesn't really do anything active. And as he leaves, he meets another divorcee, and the divorcee is trying to seduce him. And they have a really interesting conversation where she says that she still believes that she can be happy someday. And he says, "I see you haven't lost your imagination." And that kind of hints at the central theme of the movie, which is that these ideas of happiness that we have are strictly imaginative, and that truly we must abandon them for reality instead. And he just kind of lives his life and accepts things as they are in a bit of a passionless way. And his doctor tells him at one point that he has to stop eating salt or it will kill him. And I want you to see the difference between how he interacts with his family at the end, and they're discussing hope and happiness.
There's this guy I've met, Joy, that I think you'd like. He's in computers, I think.
How did you meet him?
He's a neighbor of mine. You want to call him, or should I give him your number?
I'll call him.
That would be great. I think he'd really like that.
Well, what about me?
I'm looking.
Well, I like computers.
Trish, trust me on this one. Not for you.
And what about me?
I haven't forgotten, Mom. It's hard. But I'm looking for everyone.
Yeah, well, don't look for me.
Have you found somebody?
No, there's no one.
I heard Diane had a stroke.
She'll recover.
Well, that's good.
Where there's life, there's hope.
That's right.
You bet.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Could you pass over the sweet potatoes, please?
Yeah.
Hey, did anyone watch Leno last night?
Timmy. Oh, Timmy. Timmy, come over and sit on Grandma's lap. Timmy, what? Timmy?
What's the matter with Timmy?
His Tamagotchi died.
Tamagotchi.
And as you can see, he's a little bit apathetic to the idea. And he also is pouring salt on his food, which he knows could potentially kill him. So what is the movie trying to say, inevitably, of how we should live our life? I believe that it is telling us to live our life as grounded as possible and away from necessarily striving for things that we cannot have, but rather grounded in reality. Now, one thing that's interesting is I believe that Camus said that we should live our lives in order to have the most fulfilling life through freedom and revolt and passion. But I'm not an expert on this, and I'm not an expert by any means on the absurd. So if anybody has done a lot of reading, I'm interested, how can we live a life of passion if we accept that meaninglessness is inevitable? How do we find passion if we cannot latch onto these delusions or these fantasies? Where do we get any sort of drive to feel? So I'd love to hear some comments in the discussion, as well as if I've misinterpreted anything or if you've interpreted the films differently. But that being said, based on my own interpretation, do I think that this movie is 100% correct? And the answer, I think, is that there is a time and a place to accept this movie's thesis. I don't think that this movie's thesis should be something that we live through every day, because I think that doing so would potentially rob us of the joys that these quote unquote delusions can create. And that sometimes reality could potentially be overrated. And sometimes it actually might be better to play the fool, because it is within playing the fool that sometimes the most beautiful experiences can occur. However, this is why, coming back to what I said in the very beginning of this recording, that this is my comfort movie, is when you're feeling down and you're feeling depressed, or at least when I'm feeling depressed, is often because of these sort of absurd problems, these false realities, these dreams that don't really reflect the human condition in any substantial way, that bog me down. And watching this movie every time brings me back up for air, as if I was drowning, and it brings me back up to the surface, to the wonderful freedom of realizing that none of it matters. And kind of like that Indigo Girl song, you know, it helps me take life less seriously. It's only life after all. So that is why I feel like this movie is one of the most empowering movies, if you let it be, and one of the most liberating movies, if you let it be. And if you're feeling down and you're philosophically inclined, I highly recommend checking it out. And if you have any comments, please leave them in the comment box. And I would love to hear how you guys think I misinterpreted everything. So with that being said, have a happy and meaningless day. Bye.